In polling exclusively for Global News, an overwhelming majority, 82%, of Canadians say to secure their vote in an upcoming election, they want to see a reasonable plan for a timely return to balanced budgets. That's up 4 points since the last time Ipsos asked that question in September of 2020.
Based on what the government's been saying about what it wants to do with the budget, there's a pretty good alignment between what Canadians are hoping for and what it is that the government's been trial ballooning about what they want to do. What is really surprising in the numbers, though, is some of those really specific items, and you're even seeing them come out during the Liberal convention about, boosting the childcare programs, things that are related to a green recovery. Those kinds of things do not seem to have the overwhelming level of public support that things like, for example, more universal, shorter term types of supports for people who are struggling through this pandemic. That those are the things that tend to have more support associated with them. And supporting that type of public spending doesn't mean that governments have a blank check to be able to pursue whatever type of program that they want. Canadians have a fairly limited view of what this is. And not only that, there's a speed governor on here, which is a desire to see that the government's serious about at some point trying to get public spending under control. And they do see that as being part of what they should be required in the budget.
66% of Canadians also say they're in favor of the government running whatever size of deficit is necessary to get through the pandemic, up 9 points over the same period.
Even though there has been some commentary about the likelihood that there's going to be increased public spending and increasing deficits and ultimately an increase in debt. And Canadians do want to see a government at some point deal with that. In the immediate term, the real focus is on getting Canadians who need support, the type of support they need to get through this pandemic. So they're fighting right now a situation in which they believe that they need government support, and whatever needs to be done needs to be done. The issue for the federal government is how it deals with the idea that there is going to be ongoing deficits and ongoing and a building Canadian debt. And the challenge for them is to put the right tone, I would say, around this. Do they have an intention to deal with it? Is it something that's on their minds? At the moment, you don't really seem to be hearing that out of the federal government right now. It's not. They're doing this with reluctance. They seem to be doing it with a certain amount of I don't want to say jubilation, that's the wrong way to put it, but a certain amount of belief that this is a great opportunity to invest in a whole bunch of things. Well, Canadians are a little more cautious about that, I would say, than the government is right now. So even though the political support is there pretty much for whatever the government wants to do, and particularly in the short term when it comes to supporting Canadians as they get through this pandemic, but seeing that the public spending going up and celebrating spending is not really where Canadians are right now. And you see that clearly in the numbers. The longer this goes on, the longer people think it will go on. So when we initially started into this, a year ago, or slightly over a year ago, and we'd ask people back last March, for example, how long do you think this is going to last? They'd say it would be over by June. That definitely didn't happen. But the problem with that is that it sets the horizon for what people are thinking about very short term. So it's and unidimensional. It's really focused on the pandemic itself and dealing with it in immediate terms. So if you've got a government coming forward and saying, look, we've got this great idea about building back better, and we're going to have a great green recovery, and we're going to get Canada back on the right track, and all of these many myriad of different things, the potential for that to come off as not getting how desperate people are feeling right now about the short-term circumstances, that's a potential vulnerability for the government. Along with, on the other side of this, communicating the right tone about all of the spending that's going on right now being absolutely necessary, to a certain extent, somewhat with reluctance that it's being done, rather than seeing it as a great investment in all sorts of things that people want to do for the future. When you move into that space, it becomes a lot more controversial and the nation's much more divided on it.
As for priorities in the upcoming budget, 43% of Canadians want taxes reduced for low and middle income earners, while 38% want taxes hiked for the wealthy. Rounding out the top three priorities, 23% want increased spending on programs to reduce poverty.
this is one of the easiest points to score in any kind of political debate. So I was somewhat surprised that more Canadians weren't supportive of doing that. Canadians and I would say people just about anywhere, are generally supportive of taxes that they don't have to pay. So if people don't feel they're among that wealthy segment that's going to be paying the taxes, it would be pretty hard to understand why they would get less than 100% for that. But what we're seeing is a certain amount of reluctance around that. Granted, there is support for increasing taxes among the wealthy, but that support's not unanimous. And it leads one to ask the question why that might be. And it might be that they feel that the government's becoming a bit too tax happy, or that they feel that there's a potential downside for expanding potentially what the definition of what a wealthy person is, and they may get drawn into whatever that category of taxation might be. So it's not like it should have been, at least in terms of my experience, it should have been a really easy win for the government, but it doesn't seem to be overwhelmingly easy. Yes, it's easier than a lot of other things that the government could be doing, but there's still some reluctance.